Hi Ninja Nerds, in this video today we're going to be talking about the meninges. But before we get started, make sure you go over and check out ninjanerd.org. That's where all of our notes and illustrations are for every lecture we put up here on YouTube. And then you can also leave a comment down below, subscribe, and if you want, check out our merch. It's also linked down below. So as we finish our neurology series here, we're going into our meninges. So we've looked at the brain, right? We've talked about the cerebrum, we've talked about the cerebellum. We've also talked about our brainstem with our midbrain, our pons, and our medulla oblongata. We've also talked about the diencephalon, and now we're going to talk about the meninges. What are the meninges? This is these layers that are all around the brain, right? So we have the skull here, which is this black portion, right? And it's our protection around the brain. And then between the skull and then our actual brain, there's a lot of layers in here, and those are our meninges. And before we jump into what all the names of meninges are and what all of their little functions are, I want to talk about what the general function is for all of them. So when we look at the meninges, we can see that they are surrounding the brain. They also go down and surround the spinal cord. So one of the first things we want to say is that they are there for protection. So what does that mean? A couple different things. One, it's a barrier, right? So it's going to prevent things that maybe shouldn't be going into the brain in and going from out of the brain out into wherever it needs to be. So we want to talk about protection, but we're also going to talk about cushioning. Okay, so within these layers, there's also spaces we're going to be talking about, and within those spaces, we have some fluid. So a lot of fluid to either cut down on friction, to also allow for movement or the brain to float in order for it to not be compressed on any sort of vessels or any parts of the brain. So not only is there protection from any type of blunt force trauma or any type of impact, there's also the cushioning. We can also talk about then within this barrier here, we have lots of different vessels that are going to be able to move cerebral spinal fluid around. It's also going to allow us to move blood around. So we have lots of delivery of nutrients. And then not only do we have delivery of nutrients, but we can also have a deliverance of an immune response. So we have this immunology that's allowing us to happen as well in here. So be able to find out if there's a detection of any type of illness, what's going on in the brain, can we move things around in order to help with that immune response. So as we look at this, I want you to start thinking about, okay, we have the meninges. The meninges do a lot of things for us. They help protect, they help cushion, they help deliver nutrients, they help with the immune response. And when we talk further in our nursing lectures all about what's going on within these layers, we can start to think not only what is going on with the meninges, but what happens if they aren't working properly. If there's some sort of infection within the meninges, how is that going to affect our patient? So as we go through this lecture, let's talk about each layer and also the spaces in between, because those are going to help us understand not only things that can be wrong with the meninges, but something with inside the meninges, any type of bleed that's going on, how that can occur. So let's talk about that now. All right, Ninja Nerds, now let's talk about all the different layers within our meninges. So we've taken a cross-section diagram here, and we're looking at all the different layers. As you can see, we have our two hemispheres here. Doesn't matter which way you can say this is the left and this is the right, or this is the left and this is the right. That doesn't matter. What we're looking at more importantly here are all these different layers. And if we take a picture of this chunk out and we draw it down here, you can see them a little bigger. So we can start from the outside here. On top is this maroon layer, right? That's on top of our head. We have scalp, we have muscles, we have connective tissue. That's all on top of our skull. So underneath of that, we have our skull. Underneath, we have then layers, right? And we're going to talk about our layers first, and then we'll talk about the spaces in between. We have our dura mater, which is this brown and green right here. And our dura mater has two different layers. It has the endothelial and the meningeal. And you can see that because when they do separate, they create this area in here called the dural septa. And what is the purpose or the function of the dural septa? The main purpose is to just help with supportive structure. It's going to help the brain with its ability to stay where it is. It's going to keep these hemispheres where they are. It's not going to let them crush in on each other. So it's going to help create this space in there for them. In that dural septa, underneath those two layers, right, we have these two layers of our dural matter. We have our arachnoid matter. That's the orange layer here. So you can see it here as the orange layer. The arachnoid matter has these little projections here that we call arachnoid trabeculae. And what they look like are spider webs. So that's where we get the word arachnoid. So arachnoid matter has these little projections. They are connecting down into our last layer, which is our pia mater, which is the purple one here. And we can see the pia mater is all along the brain surface here. It's a very thin tissue-like layer. Okay, it goes into all the lumps, bumps, and grooves, helps deliver nutrients, helps deliver oxygen to the brain. So as we look at the meninges, we have those layers that we just talked about. The dura matter, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater, right? Those are the important layers. But the other portion of the meninges that's really important for us is also the spaces in between. And that's why I drew this little area down here so we can better see these spaces, because the spaces are really important as well. So let me take this blue marker here and just make a note of the spaces. So we have 3 spaces that we're going to touch on. Okay, the first space we're going to talk on is here, is the epidural space. So the epidural space is the area epidural above the dura mater. So above the dura mater is our epidural space, right? You see this here, and you probably heard the word epidural before because you've heard of people getting an epidural. What that means is that needle is getting inserted into this space, right? Especially along the spinal cord. This epidural space right here is an area where we have lots of blood vessels, right? It's creating cushion for the brain. It's creating some protection for the brain. And you can see that in here, if we drew all these little blood vessels, we got veins, we got some arteries, and they're all within this space, which is really important for us. So we have epidural space, dura mater. Then we have subdural space. You can see that here, it's underneath. Subdural space. Subdural space is the area underneath our dura mater. And this area is filled with our serous fluid. This is our anti-friction area. Again, it's going to help protect, it's going to help the brain be able to move and groove without having any complications. So that serous fluid in there is going to be able to allow some of that movement protection, and it's in between the layer there. So you can see subdural space is between our dura mater and our arachnoid mater. And then lastly, we have the arachnoid mater, and underneath it, we have the subarachnoid space. So the subarachnoid space is where we can see all of those trabeculae come down, but we also have cerebrospinal fluid in this space. And we talked a little bit about CSF before. Cerebrospinal fluid is this clear fluid. It's in this area, it's giving protection or buoyancy to the brain. So it's allowing the brain to kind of float and move around in there. So when we have any type of impact or trauma, the brain isn't getting full force of it, but it's able to be distributed a little bit. So you can see that the spaces have a lot of jobs or functions just like all of the layers do as well. So let's run through it really quickly one more time. As we look at this, scalp, muscles, connective tissue on top, then we have our skull. We have the epidural space where we got some blood vessels, we have some nutrients, and then we have our dura mater. Our dura mater's got 2 different layers, right? Endocoel, meningocoel. It does separate at one point in the middle here, creating the dural septa, which allows us to have some structure and support for our brain. See that? Then we have our subdural space, the one that's underneath the dura mater. That's filled with serous fluid and has other functions as well, but it's allowing for that anti-friction with all of these different layers in here. It's allowing the brain to move and groove. The arachnoid mater, which has this projections here. You can see them around those cobwebs. And then it has a space underneath it called the subarachnoid space, which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, allowing us to have that immune response, allowing to have that nutrients be delivered. And then we have our pia mater, which helps that tissue paper-like adhere to all the lumps and bumps with the brain in order to help with nutrients and oxygen to be delivered. And then we have the brain itself. So as you can see, if we have any type of issue within the brain, right, we can have some type of bleed that is within these spaces. We're going to have some type of infection within these layers that we would call meningitis. So when we jump into those in our neuro series in the future, this is an area you can refer back to of that anatomy and physiology of just, what was that again? I don't quite understand where that bleed is, or I don't quite understand where that infection is. So this will give you a better idea. So when we talk about the meninges, we're talking about that protective covering around the brain and spinal cord. So I hope this made sense. I hope you learned something. And as always, until next time.